Just for the panelists, if we're having troubles with the connection, please turn off your video while you're presenting. That usually helps. Good. So just a little bit about the panel. The panel today is broadly looking at the future of the GCC and security in the Gulf. And this is a very relevant topic, obviously, as the GCC has been under significant strain over the past years with the rift between Qatar and its neighbors, and also with the friction over the issue of Iran and its operations in the region. We have 4 excellent scholars in the panel today, which I'm very happy to introduce. They'll cover the topic from different angles. And the first panelist we're going to hear is Luciano Zaccara, who's a research assistant professor in Gulf politics at the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University, and a visiting assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar as well. Luciano is going to present a paper on state-society relations in the GCC states, focusing on citizenship as a resource of power. Next panelist is Kristian Ulrichsen, who's a fellow for the Middle East at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University, and has recently published a book actually on Qatar and the Gulf crisis. Kristian will be speaking about the future of the GCC and on Gulf politics in general in light of the Qatar rift. And also he's going to touch on the partial de-escalation of Saudi Emirate-Iran tensions and of the impact of COVID-19. So that's going to be an interesting presentation as well. We also have Olivia, who is a PhD candidate in international relations at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She's researching on power and ideology in the politics and international relations of Iran. And she's going to present a book chapter of hers, which is entitled The Deal of Discontent, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Nuclear Deal. And finally, we have an additional panelist who's not on the list, but he's a well-known face though. It's Simon Mabon, who besides being the project director of SAPAD, is also a senior lecturer in international relations at Lancaster University and the director of the Richardson Institute for Peace and Conflict Research. And Simon is going to speak about building security in the Gulf and about the interaction of regional and local levels with a focus on Saudi-Iranian relations. So welcome to you all once again. And I think I'm going to end my introduction here and give the word over to Luciano. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everybody listen to me and see me? I assume that this is a yes. Okay, well, thank you very much to the organizers and to Simon for inviting me to present here. This is this presentation, which is part of an unfinished work. I will try to discuss, as Anne said, state-society relations and interstate relations within the Gulf Cooperation Council states from the citizenship approach, addressing the question of how citizenship's legislations or law are employed as a mean of political control and regime survival, and how this can evolve in the future. First, I will briefly detail the citizenship legislation that determines who is and can become citizen in any of the GCC states. Second, I will discuss some aspects of the versatility in the application of the naturalization and revocation policies. For instance, naturalization of children of national women married with foreigners, dual citizens, and stateless people. Then I will briefly explain how Arab Spring and the GCC crisis impacted in implementation of those citizenship policies that in some cases reinforced the discrimination against some societal groups with the aim of strengthening the national identity and social cohesion. Finally, we'll make some conclusions and questions for future investigation and for the future of the GCC, having in mind that this panel is looking more to the future than to the past. Rapid demographic growth that followed the oil discovery in the GCC states and the new rentier relationships established between the rulers and the people determined the design of citizenship legislation that limited access to the socio-economic benefits provided by the new welfare states. Simultaneously, Gulf authorities engaged in the construction of a national identity narratives that promoted the tribal Arab-Sunni identity to enhance the feeling of belonging of citizens to the state and ultimately to preserve the socio-political status quo. Although these policies have favored the formation of a very hierarchically stratified society, they have not obstructed the development of unified national identities that largely legitimize the current rulership. The emergency of categories of citizenship with different rights and duties, which are mainly related to their access to the socioeconomic benefits of these frontier states, have resulted in ensuring the loyalty of the most privileged and also the less favored who aspire to achieve a better status, leaving just a minority to question the government. This is one of the main aspects of social or political control. The discovery of oil, the presence of the UK as a foreign power in the Gulf, and the extensive population exchanges between both shores of the Persian Gulf and along the Indian Ocean explain the diverse cultural origin of the people of the Gulf, the Khaliji people, where different ethnic groups coexisted, contributing to the multicultural character of the pre-oil Gulf societies. However, the fast development and the migrants' influx that followed the discovery of oil required the establishment of modern states with delimited borders and legislation identifying citizens in every state. I mean, who is a citizen in every state? Based on a rentier economy, this relation eventually turned into a patron-client relationship, a social contract that was the base for the citizenship policy design in the Gulf, as well as for the political systems that they were designed afterwards, and that granted very limited political rights to the citizens. In this context, several levels of beneficiaries emerged conditioned by their ethnic, tribal, and religious affiliations. Viewing considerable growth of oil income and population, citizenship and naturalization policies were then designed to limit access to those resources to the welfare states. At the same time, largely ignoring the historical multiculturalism previously mentioned of these societies, new narratives of national identity were carefully constructed around the central role of sheikhs and welfare providers. Likewise, citizenship and naturalization legislation established the eligibility criteria based on kinship, territorial, ethnic, and linguistic affiliations. Nationals became a privileged minority with a proportion of migrants that currently is reaching an amount that more or less everybody knows, around 80, 85, 89% in the UAE, 85% in Qatar, 68% in Kuwait, more than half in Bahrain, 31% in Saudi Arabia, and 30% in Oman. Citizenship policies then were designed based on the establishment of new borders and using historical milestones to determine claimants' legitimacy to citizenship. I will briefly detail some of the aspects of the citizenship legislation in the GCC context. In Saudi Arabia, the Royal Decree of 1954 and then the Basic Law of 1992, modified in 2005, established the criteria to define who is a Saudi citizen. Literally says those who acquire the Ottoman nationality in the year 1914 while being native to the territory of Saudi Arabia. This is one of the cases. Ottoman citizens born in Saudi Arabia or resident from 1914 until September 30, 1926, and who have not acquired any other citizenship before that date. And non-Ottoman citizens who reside in Saudi Arabia from 1914 to September 30, 1926, and who have not acquired any other citizenship before the dates. These are the three cases in which someone can be determined as a Saudi citizen. There is no transmission of citizenship to relatives, including the law. Dual citizenship is not allowed. Revocation is allowed, or I mean, is considered. And naturalized citizens, with the difference compared with the original ones, have the same political rights, but they cannot be members of the Consultative Council. This more or less is the same case in all the 6 GCC states. In Kuwait, the law was from 1959 and the Constitution of 1964 62, sorry, and in Constitution 1992. Original Kuwaitis in those laws is established as those who reside in its territory before 1920 and did not change residence until the new law came into force. So they're establishing a very clear time landmark, the same that in the Saudi case. Naturalization is possible for those of Arab origin with 15 years of legal residence in the country and non-Arab with more than 20 years residing in the country. Again, no transmission of citizenship of the children of a Kuwaiti women married with a foreigner. Dual citizenship is not allowed. Revocation is allowed. In this case, naturalized citizens cannot have political rights until they reach 30 years of naturalization. So this is also an important element that differentiates original from naturalized citizens. The same happened in Oman with the law established with the citizenship established in the Constitution of 1996 and reformed in 2014 after the Arab Spring. It's the most open in terms of naturalizations, but again, it's establishing some limitations. Dual citizenship is not allowed. No transmission to children born from Omani women married to a foreigner, and limited political rights to those who became naturalized. Similarly, Bahrain, although non-Arab residents in this case can be naturalized if they reside for at least 25 years consecutively in Bahrain, 15 years if in the case of other Arab citizens that owns a real estate. No transmission of citizenship is allowed, and revocation is also allowed to the governments. In this case, naturalized Bahraini can exercise political rights, vote, and be members of both parliament chambers after 10 years of obtaining the citizenship. So in case of political participation, it's the most open one compared with the other GCC states. In the Qatari case, the law established in 1961 and amended in 2005 established that Qataris are those residents in the national territory who have held regular residence until since 1930. So again, we have a time landmark. Qatari descendants born in or out of the country, and those born in Qatar to an unknown parents. So in this case, again, we have a time landmark. We have a naturalization. The possibility to be naturalized after 25 years of continuous residence in the country. No transmission of citizenship to relatives, and no right to exercise political and electoral rights to those who are not original citizens. Finally, Emirates, the law was established in 1992 and reformed in 2009. In this case, it's allowing any Arab originally from Oman, Qatar, or Bahrain to obtain Emirati citizenship if they have legally resided in the country for more than 3 years, and by those belonging to tribes from the Arabian Peninsula who have resided in the Emirates for more than 3 years, and then any Arab who have resided in the country since 1940. So these are the cases in which other non-Emiratis can become Emiratis. Revocation is allowed, like in every GCC states, and in this case, Emirati women married to foreigners can transmit citizenship to their children since 2011, which was one of the positive changes after the Arab Spring. This review of brief review and quick review of citizenship legislation shows how restrictive it is regarding foreigners' naturalization and the transmission of rights to relatives in most of the cases, and the fundamental role that citizenship has played in the process of state building and the national identity narrative. Therefore, the practice of granting and revoking citizenship in the GCC context also demonstrate how these policies were used as a political tool to control dissent within the state, mainly since the Arab Spring in 2011, but also to pressure other states within the GCC context mainly since the GCC diplomatic rift that started in 2014. I will mention some cases, but I'm going to reduce them because of the time is running. We have the very known case of the stateless or bidun, who are residents who, for different reasons, have come to find themselves living in the GCC countries without nationality. So these people were people that they were not able to demonstrate that they breached the requirements of the citizenship laws or constitution to claim citizenship in these GCC states. The figures are not very clear. In Kuwait is the country that is reportedly having the biggest amount of biduns, around 100,000. But in sum, the lack of citizenship granted to this group of people in the whole Arabian Peninsula made them not to be beneficiary by the welfare state system, nor they have the chance to have any political or civil rights. Their mobility is very limited. The possibility to work also within one country or any other GCC countries is very reduced. And it also, in several years, it was used as a pressure tool between the GCC states, affecting somehow bilateral relations within the framework of the organization. Other cases, as we mentioned, foreign husband married to national women, that at the end of the day, and including the authorization that every citizen in the GCC context, if maybe it's an exception, but I'm not quite sure if it really exists, that everybody needs an approval, an authorization from the Ministry of Interior to get married, mainly when you are marrying a foreigner. And the lack of this right of transfer the nationality to those children that are married, that are coming from a marriage between national women with a foreign citizen, is working as a discouragement tool to prevent marriages outside the circle of the nationals and outside the circle of those who are determined to be national or allowed to be citizens. The naturalization of foreigners to increase the national population of certain tribal or religious group has been also a very powerful tool that all the GCC states were using, either as an electioneering tool or a gerrymandering tool, or to perpetuate particular identity of the states. And in this case, we have several cases. In Bahrain, for instance, there was a report, the Bandar report in 2006, that revealed a 5-year plan designed to change the demographic Sunni-Shia balance and the propagation of anti-Shia ideology. This report stated that over 50,000 Jordanians, Syrians, and Yemenis from Sunni background were recruited to the security forces and granted citizenship. It also confirmed that around 8,000 Saudis from the Dawasir tribe were naturalized without losing their their Saudi nationality, which is actually against any law of the GCC. The aim of granting them the right to vote was intended to counterbalance the main Shia opposition party Al-Wefaq that was then dissolved in 2018, if I'm not wrong. Most citizenship laws, as I said, they ban explicitly dual citizenship. However, there are many cases in which it was recognized that, for instance, in the Saudi Kuwaiti case, almost 500,000 people are recognized to have dual citizenship. The same that happened between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And this is particularly relevant during electoral processes in which these dual citizens can cross the border to vote in Bahrain or in Kuwait. And how this dual citizenship can be used either to punish or to reward a particular group of people. In Qatar, the suspicion that the Saudi Arabia has been part of the failed coup against the Emir Hamad in 1996, with the support of certain individuals from the Gufran clan from the Al-Murad tribe, ended with the revocation of the Qatari citizenship of about 5,000 people from the clan in April 2005 and their deportation to Saudi Arabia. If we move to the Arab Spring, I mean, the GCC states adopted a combination of redistributive, electoral, and repressive measures to minimize the destabilizing effects of the revolt, including the use of the citizenship and naturalization policies. Again, both as a punishment mechanism against the opposition and as a tool to reinforce the state's social support base by removing any element that threatened the state security and social cohesion. We have many cases. I'm going to mention a few of them. The UAE, dozens of naturalized citizens that they were accused of acting against the security of the state were stripped from their citizenship, and some of them were granted, for instance, Comoros citizenship in order to avoid them to be stateless and allowing the government to deport them from the UAE. The Bahraini government also reformed the citizenship law in 2014 after the Arab Spring, including more cases for the citizenship revocation because of public order, security, and threats to the state. Over 1,000 people were reportedly revoked citizenship since then, being accused of having links with Iran or ISIS. In Kuwait, the same, at least dozens of Kuwaitis were revoked citizenship. And also in the case of Oman, where the law was amended in 2014, although I couldn't find reported cases of revocation. To end, the GCC crisis also affected the way in which citizenship policies were used as a political tool. The crisis actually started in 2014, severely damaged the Khaliji identity, which facilitated the cultural and economic exchange between its citizens. It has become, since the GCC crisis, imperative to differentiate each state's identity from the others to the extent of disallowing even the expression of sympathy to other states, and reinforces the demonstration of loyalty and the punishment of those who do not comply with it. So the citizenship policies were also used as a tool of that. In 2014, Bahrain accused Qatar of offering citizenship and economic benefits to Bahraini Sunni citizens that had previously historical links with Qatar. Also after 2017 blockade started, around 60 Qataris with tribal background were stripped of their citizenship, allegedly due to the lack of support to the Qatari government, and also Saudi Arabia and the UAE were accused of violation of human rights for impeding mixed families to be recruited. To conclude, citizenship and national identity policies have historically been central pillars of the construction and survival of the state in the GCC monarchies. In this regard, the analysis of the versatility in the application of legislation regarding naturalization and citizenship withdrawal, the discrimination of children born to national women married to foreigners, and the situation of stateless people reflects how these policies are employed as means of socio-political control within the states and also among GCC states. Given that citizenship is mainly attached to socio-economic benefits of the rentier welfare state, citizenship is not treated as a right, but as a grace bestowed by the authorities based on mainly ethnic and religious, but also political and ideological criteria. Although this intensifies social inequality and discrimination, it has actually played a fundamental role in regime stability, with stick and carrot domestic policies that have resulted in withholding socio-economic and political claims. The analysis of post-Arab Spring legislation, just to finish, the arbitrary granting of withdrawal of citizenship, as well as discussions on states' responses to the Gulf diplomatic crisis, demonstrate that citizenship is a fundamental resource of power in the GCC regimes, especially at times of crisis. While the rentier social contract is in place, these strategies contribute to enhancing the loyalty of the privileged citizens and ultimately guarantee regime survival. The question for further studies is how this policy will affect long-term stability, regime stability, especially in the aftermath of rentierism and in the Gulf states. Thank you, and sorry for the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luciano, for an extremely interesting presentation. I'll give the word quickly to Kristian so he can continue with his presentation. welcome Kristian again.
Thank you. Well, thank you for putting together these series of panels, and thank you for inviting me to be on one of them on the final day. I'll talk a bit about the future of the GCC, and Luciano touched on some of the issues that have been challenging the region over the past 6-7 years. And I'll look at how Gulf politics is perhaps realigning in the wake of events in 2019 and the considerable shock in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that the Trump administration chose not to respond to the pattern of attacks and incidents in the Gulf in May, June, and September 2019, and has led to a certain desire to de-escalate tension in the region. That is perhaps an inadvertent plus point of the Trump administration's maverick approach to regional affairs. It's kept its partners in the Gulf on their toes and kind of trying to second guess an administration and to second guess tenets of a relationship that I think has really been under a lot of strain over the past few years. 2017, well, as Luciano said, the blockade of Qatar began in 2017, the blockade, the embargo, whatever you would like to call it, has its roots in 2014 in the iteration of the 9-month diplomatic dispute that year. But for my purposes, I'll talk about since 2017, since June 17, when Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt joined again to announce political, economic, diplomatic isolation of Qatar. And it's really hit at the weak points of the GCC. It's hit at several weak points. One weak point is that the GCC is by inherent nature a highly imbalanced entity. You have one country, Saudi Arabia, that is about 7 times larger than the next biggest country by size, Oman. And Oman is bigger than the other 4 countries put together, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and UAE. There's also a big conventional imbalance in population and conventional metrics of power. And throughout the last 40 years now, almost 40 years since the GCC was formed in 1981, the 5 smaller Gulf states have all had degrees of concern that a Saudi top-heavy GCC would be detrimental to their interests. And this hasn't just been in the last few years. Qatar, in 2000s, for example, there was a number of issues with Abu Dhabi in Saudi Arabia, where the UAE was concerned about a Saudi top-heavy GCC. If you remember, in 2009, the UAE withdrew from monetary union in the attempt to form a Gulf single currency because the central bank location was given to Riyadh and not to Abu Dhabi. The Emiratis felt very strongly that they should have the right to host it, and that if a monetary authority was based in Saudi Arabia, it would add further to the Riyadh centricity of the GCC. So we've seen a consistent, and in the security, for example, in Kuwait has always been hesitant about a closer security pact. Kuwait resisted Saudi-led attempts to form an internal security pact in 1982 and again in 1994, and still hasn't technically ratified the pact of 2012, even though it's kind of been implemented unofficially. So there's always been a degree of concern among the 5 smaller Gulf states about a Saudi top-heavy GCC, and about Saudi Arabia throwing its weight around geopolitically. And Saudi Arabia, of course, now with Abu Dhabi especially, and I think we have to distinguish when we say with the UAE, that Abu Dhabi is the driving force within the UAE of this sort of realignment of Gulf politics with Saudi Arabia, the 2 crown princes, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, this sort of new axis within the Gulf. The Saudi Emirati pressure, both in 2014 and 2017 on Qatar, this really strikes at the heart of this throwing their weight around. That really was some of the underlying tensions and flashpoints within the GCC. The sight of the 2 countries throwing their weight around against Qatar in 2014, beginning within weeks of a new emir coming to power in Doha, first signs of pressure began in July 2013, within weeks, and then again in 2017, has really hit the GCC at one of its weak points. And believe me, people in Kuwait and people in Oman have noticed, and especially in Oman, were thinking, well, could this be us next? Could the attempt to put pressure on a new leader as he comes to power and begins to find his position domestically, could that be replicated? And especially as Sultan was aged and Oman grew closer to a transition, that concern was often expressed. And we've obviously had that transition. To some extent, the transition has been overtaken by the unprecedented impact of COVID-19. But it was very much a degree of concern. Also, the fact that the GCC as an institution was absent at almost every stage of the 2017 crisis. Even though the GCC has a dispute resolution mechanism, it wasn't used. The GCC wasn't used as the entity to which the Saudis or Emiratis would channel their frustration or their grievances or complaints to Qatar. It wasn't used to try and resolve the dispute or to mediate. The mediation was led by the Emir of Kuwait, who undertook a frenetic round of shuttle diplomacy in the first few days that, at least in his own words, when he met with Donald Trump in September 2017, prevented it from escalating further. The GCC has really been silent since. If you look at the summit meetings that have been held, the actual crisis has barely been raised. It's almost as if they're meeting in a parallel reality to some extent. And so again, the notion of the value of belonging to a GCC, which has twice in little more than 3 years failed to prevent 3 of its members from turning on a fourth, will have consequences. The GCC that we have today is a weaker GCC than we had up until 2017. We've taken the sort of political level of the GCC where leaders can meet and talk and formulate joint plans and strategies has really been taken out. The GCC we see today is much more of a collection of technocratic committees, of health ministers, of commerce ministers, of finance ministers, of sport authorities that meet technocratically, and they meet on issues where you actually can try and take the politics out of it, but as a sort of mechanism for bringing leaders together to discuss common issues, and of course issues of common threat perception as well. That has really been really been impacted by 2017. And if you also think that the GCC came together at such speed in 1981 as a defensive reaction against 2 regional events, the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution in 1978-79 and the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War, there was at least enough consensus of a common threat perception that the 6 Gulf states were better together. But over the past 4 years, if you look at a threat matrix from the perspective of Abu Dhabi or Doha, they see each other as kind of primary threats rather than external. And so you've seen a reshaping of threat perceptions as well in ways that will really make it very hard, I think, for the GCC as an entity to recohere to anything like it was, and also for the parties to the conflict or parties to the dispute to sort of overcome a lot of the mistrust over the past 4 years and to sort of recohere. And we've now seen, for example, the US administration, which has tried and supported its partners in the Gulf to recohere for several years now, acknowledging that actually it's probably not a possibility right now, trying to develop pragmatic workarounds instead, one of which has been the Middle East Strategic Alliance to try and at least maintain a modicum of intelligence, security, and defense coordination with the US, where you can at least have a degree of functioning coordination. The GCC crisis was stuck and remains stuck. I mean, nothing I've seen really has changed our view. It was stuck partly because no one party wanted to be the one that backed away first. And to some extent, all parties to the dispute could live with it. The Qataris moved on, they restructured trade routes, they took a hit to be sure in short term, but they very quickly managed to move on. And for the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Qatar was not an issue that was so great for them that they felt they had to make the first move. There were hopes at the end of 2019 there would be a Saudi-Qatari thaw, degree of rapprochement. But actually, Mohammed bin Salman went to Abu Dhabi in November 2019, spent 4 days in the UAE for the Abu Dhabi Formula One Grand Prix and for the Saudi Emirati Coordination Council. And Qatari officials reported that after that, the hopes for Saudi-Qatari law kind of just lessened. Whatever was said in Abu Dhabi was such that Saudi willingness to at least come to an agreement with Qatar on certain issues quickly fell away. What I would say, though, is that in 2019, we had the pattern of attacks in and around the Gulf. We had the attacks on the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia and on maritime shipping off the coast of Fujairah and in the Gulf of Oman. In May and June 2019, we then had the unprecedented attack on Abqaiq and Khurais in Saudi Arabia in September. Unprecedented if you look at the scale and complexity of it compared to the AQAP attack on Abqaiq in 2006, which was basically a couple of guys in a truck busting the gate and blowing themselves up. I mean, this was different on so many levels. But what really was the turning point was the demonstration effect of the Trump administration doing nothing, at least nothing visible, either in May or in June or in September. The Trump administration did respond when US targets were hit. The Trump administration responded in June when the US drone that had taken off from the UAE was shot down in the Gulf. And they responded then by attacking Iran's electronic warfare capabilities with a cyber attack. And they responded in December when an American contractor was killed in Iraq. And we had then the assassination of Qasem Soleimani at the beginning of January. So from a Gulf point of view, or at least a Saudi Emirati point of view especially, there was a distinction being drawn by the US, or at least by the Trump administration, between US interests being hit and those of their partners being hit. And that really had a sobering effect in the sense that when it came to Gulf policy, the Emiratis and Saudis until 2019, it really acted as if there was no divergence at all between their interests and the interests of the Saudis and Emiratis. And you see that in 2015, for example, when the Saudis and Emiratis go into Yemen, effectively daring the Obama administration to stop them, almost as a quid pro quo for them supporting the JCPOA, which happened at almost exactly the same week that at least the negotiation had taken place the same week that the war in Yemen began. The Saudis and Emiratis suddenly realized in 2019 that they were on their own much more than they thought they were, and that they couldn't trust the Trump administration, just as they felt they couldn't trust the Obama administration over the JCPOA. To feel abandoned by one US president is bad enough, but to feel abandoned by two was a real shock to the system. And so within weeks, we saw the beginnings of a de-escalation. We saw the beginnings of the Emiratis sending a Coast Guard delegation and trying to reach out to Iran to some extent. The Saudis doing the same through third parties in Iraq and in Pakistan. And of course, both the UAE and Saudi Arabia responding in January 2020 to the spike in tension following the death of Soleimani with a call for restraint. It was very different from, say, the rhetoric in 2017 when Mohammed bin Salman was saying, for example, we need to make sure that any fight with Iran takes place in Iran and not in Saudi Arabia. That sobering effect was very strong. And it may yet open up a degree of space now that all parties in the Gulf realize they have to live with each other based on their own capacities, not necessarily on the capacities of the US behind them. I would finally just talk quickly about why I think we're still stuck, even though COVID-19 has shown once again that all geopolitical squabbles pale now to insignificance compared to the double hit that the GCC has taken from not only the crushing of oil prices, partly because of the Saudi decision to escalate production, but also because of the huge collapse in demand, but also for the economic dislocation, which also hits the Gulf in some of the very sectors, such as aviation, transport, and trade, turning the Gulf into hubs where it's kind of entertainment and hospitality, where it really hurts. But in February, just as the COVID pandemic was beginning to be appreciated, the extent of its disruption, we had the reports of a Qatari health delegation being denied entry into Saudi Arabia. And we then had various continuations of the tit-for-tat social media and media campaigns, whereby Qatar was being blamed for the spread of the virus, and Qatar and Iran were being blamed. There was a spat at the end of March when Qatar Airways repatriated a bunch of Bahrainis from Iran, and then Bahrain refused to take them in, so they were stuck in Doha. There was a kind of escalation of rhetoric then. So it seems that at least for now, even though arguably there are much bigger fish to fry, and all GCC states face a common challenge now, there hasn't been any resolution on the dispute. And I will just finally end by putting it to you that Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed was willing to pick up the phone and call Bashir al-Assad a couple of weeks ago. But he wasn't willing and remains unwilling to do the same to the Qataris. And that, I think, should give an idea of just how stuck the GCC dispute remains, not just now, but potentially for what a post-COVID Gulf will look like as well. So with that, I'll pass you back to Anne.
Thank you so much, Kristian, for a fascinating presentation. Just for the participants, before we move on to Olivia, I'd like to remind you that the Q&A function is open and you can post your questions as we go along. So if you have questions for the two first panelists, please post them there and we'll take them up in the Q&A session. Thank you. So Olivia, I'll give the word to you.
Perfect. Super, thank you very much. And also thank you very much to all the participants who have joined our discussion today. And of course, also thank you and a shout out to the SEPA team behind the scenes today, to Anna, Samira, Iyad, Elias, and Eddie for bringing this event to life. As Anna-Kristina mentioned in her introduction, I'm going to talk about two other immensely important countries bordering the Gulf, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I'm going to examine their relation through or against the background of the nuclear deal. And this deal, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, had been preceded by more than 10 years of intense negotiations until it was eventually signed in 2015 by the P5+1. That's the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. And the deal had actually prompted high expectations and had been hailed as a historic deal that would further peace, stability, and security in the region by restraining Iran's nuclear program. However, with alliances seemingly shifting in favor of Iran, tipping the balance of power in the region, the deal became a source of discontent for Saudi Arabia. So departing from the two countries' contrasting positions, with Saudi Arabia being critical of the deal and Iran being in favor of it, I argue that the competition between the two countries has a symbolic dimension, where both parties aim at shaping the image of the Islamic Republic in accordance with the positions towards the deal. So to this end, they're exercising symbolic power, which includes, amongst others, but not solely, the discursive instrumentalization of sectarian identities, which then eventually also feeds or may feed into sectarian divisions. I further contend that both countries' foreign policy discourses are interdependent and shaped by the symbolic discursive exchange on the international stage. AK also mentioned this as part of a book chapter, and so in this chapter, I'm examining Saudi Arabia's and Iran's purposeful construction and strategic framing of the other and the self, respectively, the formation of narratives, and how the discursive interaction and deployment of symbolic power in foreign policy discourse is, on the one hand, conducive to obstructing, on the other hand, conducive to facilitating endeavors of peace, stability, and security. The timeframe examined spans roughly from the signing of the deal in 2015 to the US's unilateral abandonment of it in 2018. I also would like to note here that I concur with Chris Phillips' arguments that he made this week on Wednesday in a very, very interesting presentation on Syria. And Chris mentioned, amongst others, that Iran and Saudi Arabia are very often framed as sectarian actors, and that their actions and differences, for that matter, are very often represented as being supposedly driven by the fact that both countries' populations predominantly adhered to different branches of Islam. And as Chris elaborated, the support for sectarian groups, while not necessarily being the first choice anyways, they resort to this for pragmatic reasons and in order to reach their interests if other ways have proven not to be conducive to this end. And similarly, this also applies to physical. This does not only apply to physical, but similarly also to verbal actions. And those are my focus. Saudi and Iran are both very ambitious. And of course, they are very much reiterating that they're interested in peace, security, and stability in the region. But nonetheless, both of them are seeking to emerge as leading actors in the region. And in this way, each of them seeks to influence the regional order, and both try to exert substantial influence on their neighboring states. Saudi Arabia sees itself as being at the core of the Arab and Islamic worlds, representing the heart of Islam, and Saudi Arabia contends that geographic, cultural, social, demographic, and economic advantages had enabled it to take a leading position in the world. Iran similarly understands itself as a solid regional power with significant potential for a prominent regional and global role. However, it needs to be noted that Saudi Arabia and Iran are departing from very different vantage points. And here I would like to, in a nutshell, venture very briefly into recent history. And since the revolution of 1979, we can see that it had been a fundamental and abrupt turning point for Iran in the region. It had meant the rupture of old alliances and brought about a drastic reorientation and reordering of relations in line with Iran's ideological position on the one hand, and the perception of Iran's ambitions on the other hand. One of the casualties of that time was Iran's relation with the US. No more was Iran the US's regional anchor for its foreign policy or an island of stability. So Saudi Arabia came forward to fill that void as the United States' preferred partner in the region, whereas Iran had fallen from grace and was increasingly isolated and subsequently placed under long-lasting and intense sanctions, not least to its reignited and heavily scrutinized nuclear program. So now, with the advent of the nuclear deal, seemingly contributing to the normalizations with Iran, the status quo of regional arrangements appeared to be at stake. Iran seemed to be able to substantially better its position and international standing, and to be able to emerge from the sanctions regime and to re-enter the international community and economic system. For some, the nuclear agreement was significant because it meant increased security and stability by restraining Iran's nuclear program. For others, it meant the opposite, or so it is represented, a threat to security and stability, and therefore to peace. But in any case, a change in the balance of power was looming on the horizon, leading to increased discontent on the Saudi part, which was increasingly and strongly verbalized. However, with this, I do not want to say that the nuclear deal is the only event that impacted or impacts Saudi-Iranian relations. Kristian also briefly alluded to some, because there is a whole host of issues, and apart from the ones mentioned, I mean, we have the wars in Yemen and Syria, just to name two more. In general, we can say that the relationship has been oscillating between sometimes more favorable, sometimes less favorable times. But generally, they're quite restrained and not really amicable. So, however, while keeping these other issues in mind, we'll concentrate here on the discourse surrounding the nuclear deal. Before we move on, I would like to jump a little bit into theory. I have mentioned in the introduction that Saudi and Iran are engaging in strategic framing and the construction of narratives. Frames and narratives are frequently used terms, actually, and I think so it is worthwhile to to say a few explanatory words, what they actually are and what they do. Frames are specific metaphors and symbolic representations. They take part in shaping our interpretation of the world. They're established and preconceived ideas that are activated in people's minds through the use of certain language, that is, certain terms. So in order to make reference to an existent frame, and hence to conjure up certain ideas, terms that connect to that frame will be used. And once a frame is created and established through repetition, it can be called up upon any time. So for example, when using terms such as enemy, military, weapons, it points to a frame of war. Frames are mental structures and are invisible, but nonetheless are defining our approach to our environment, how we perceive it and how we interpret it. In other words, framing consists of the filtering of certain elements of reality and the rearrangement into a comprehensive narrative. So frames influence how we act, how we feel, how we take decisions, and how we form an opinion. And consequently, through a dedicated and focused process of reframing public discourse by using different language, it is possible to change how the public sees the world. Therefore, careful and strategic framing constitutes a means for actors to advance their interests. And thus, they compete over the representation of certain events, other actors, or also themselves, in order to shape people's view of them. In other words, in Lisa Veden's words, politics is therefore not merely about material interests, but also about contests over the symbolic world, over the management and appropriation of meaning. And narratives, quite like frames, are a similarly powerful means, and through narratives it is possible to connect with and to convey political views to an audience in a rather direct way. It is because stories have a more immediate quality than rational arguments, so it is more easily internalized by people. So in this sense, the one who's able to dominate or to influence the narratives that surround us also holds quite a high amount of power. And this in particular, when narratives are widely shared and circulated through the media, and particularly social media, narratives are capable of shaping public perception about politically relevant events, relations, and people. So when they're widely shared, circulated, and repeated, narratives filter into people's minds and become part of the habitus through a process of accrual. In this context, Ali Ansari has observed that an opinion repeated often enough becomes fact. Consensus becomes common sense, and common sense structures our thoughts. Looking at this in action now, coming to the Saudi Iranian case, so we can observe in general terms that Saudi Arabia is generally portraying Iran as a threat. And in order to do so, Saudi representatives use frames that are explicitly negative, and they're supposed to evoke suspicion, insecurity, distrust, and fear. And I would like to mention here a couple of corresponding, just as some examples, a couple of narratives that are being formed. For example, Iran talks pretty, but its actions show otherwise. Iran intends to export the revolution. Iran commits and supports acts of terrorism. Iran interferes in other countries' affairs. And to illustrate this, I'll draw here on a piece written by Adel bin Ahmed Al-Jubair in the New York Times in early January 2016, where he asks, can Iran change? At this time, Al-Jubair was still the Saudi foreign minister. And he writes, the world is watching Iran for signs of change, hoping it will evolve from a rogue revolutionary state into a respectable member of the international community. But Iran, rather than confronting the isolation it has created for itself, opts to obscure its dangerous sectarian and expansionist policies. And he goes on to say, or he writes, that the Iranian government's behavior has been consistent since the 1979 revolution. The constitution that Iran adopted states the objective of exporting the revolution. As a consequence, Iran has supported violent extremist groups, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and sectarian militias in Iraq. And relating all this to the nuclear deal, Al-Jubair, at another occasion, it was actually in a speech at Chatham House, he said that since the JCPOA was signed, Iran used the income from the JCPOA in order to fund its mischievous activities. So in response to all this, now looking at the Iranian side, Iran responds to the sectarian allegations on the occasion of the UN General Assembly in 2016, where President Rouhani speaks. And here he says that Iran actually opposes any kind of sectarianism and any attempt to promote religious gaps. And he further says that the Muslim people, be they Shias or Sunnis, have and continue to live together for centuries in harmony and mutual respect. So we can already see here that with this statement that Iran overall tries to strike a rather conciliatory tone, and particularly when it comes to its neighbors. Iran generally places emphasis on togetherness, on common goals, on guiding principles, such as mutual respect and non-interference that should inform relations in order to be beneficial for all parties. And in this vein, at the inception of his assignment, Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif also stresses common bonds of religion, common bonds of history, culture, and assures Iran's neighbors that they have a reliable partner in Iran, and this partner extends its hand in friendship to its neighbors. So thus, notwithstanding endeavors of engagement with Western nations, Iran's primary focus its primary foreign policy focus is its neighbors. And in fact, good neighborly relations in the immediate and further neighborhood and the mutual consideration of interests are pivotal for Iran's own security and stability. I have reached the 15-minute mark. I will end here. More to be read though in our book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you for your interesting presentation as well. I can see a lot of questions are coming in the Q&A box, which is great to see. Now we have the final panelist, which is Simon Mabon. So Simon, please go ahead, present.
Sure, thank you so much, AK. Thank you everyone on the panel, and a huge thank you to everyone for making it to almost the end of this long week of webinars. A huge thank you to all of the CEPAD team as well. You've been wonderful making this happen. So thank you very much. My paper today is sort of a halfway house between all of the various papers that have been presented. It's been sort of forged in the embers of the intellectual thought that was presented over the past hour or so. And then I should also add that it's been reforged as new ideas are coming out. But the main thrust of what I wanted to explore was how across the Gulf, what we have seen recently is the conflation of domestic and regional politics, and that if we want to understand what's happening domestically, we need to look at the ways in which regional politics has evolved. And as I have argued elsewhere, I think there's also an interesting dimension in the sense that domestic politics also has the capacity to shape regional politics. But that's perhaps a conversation for another day. What I think we do need to focus on, though, is the coming together of these two levels of analysis, which can really help us to understand a lot more about what's going on. I mean, I've got a couple of examples that I can use here just to demonstrate what is happening. And I think there's a clear political dimension at play in terms of how one defines politics and how one defines a political community. We talked a bit about this the other day in terms of inclusion and exclusion, the definition of a political community and the definition of what a community is not. And in addition to that, there is a security dimension to these articulations of inclusion and exclusion. And that's where I think that the regional level comes out. We can see the security dimension in terms of the way in which the Bidoun have been framed as a threat to the Kuwaiti state, dating all the way back to the 1920s, of course. That was framed in security terms. But if we look closer to the present, if we look in terms of what's happening in terms of Egypt, we look at what's happening in Bahrain, we can see that there is this real conflation of domestic politics with regional affairs. And I'm thinking in particular of two cases. One is the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in Bahrain, which was obviously absolutely central in the ways in which the Al Khalifa, the ruling Al Khalifa family, was able to circumvent the challenges posed by what I think was essentially a desectarianizing movement, a movement in 2011 that sought to reject this cultivation of divisions within Bahraini society. We all know the chants of not Sunni, not Shia, just Bahraini. But what the regime did was very carefully and very quickly framed the protesters along these divided lines. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Bahrain was a really key part of this because of the ways in which it exacerbated the regime's message and posited a vehemently anti-Shia message. Yet after 2014, the Brotherhood took on a different form in Bahraini politics, and that was because of broader regional affairs, in the sense that Saudi Arabia became increasingly concerned about the ways in which political Islam was taking hold across the Gulf. So you start to see that the Brotherhood is prescribed as an opposition group, and it's pushed to the margins of society, much like other forms of dissent and opposition to the Al Khalifa in Bahrain post 2014. As Luciano was arguing earlier on, the roots of this are actually much earlier. The roots of gerrymandering, the playing with identity in Bahrain goes much earlier. You can trace this all the way back to the 60s and 70s perhaps, but the decade before, the gerrymandering was documented extensively in the Bandar report, which I've written about in a piece in Middle East Journal, and Justin Gengler has also documented in a piece I think called Royal Factionalism, which articulates what was happening in this Bandar report. But essentially it was about the manipulation of identities within the context of a political system, using the political tools at the means of the regime because of concerns about rising Shia influence. And this, of course, goes hand in hand with a changing regional dynamic that meant that there was broader anti-Shia sentiment across the Gulf. Okay, so that's one set of issues that I think are interesting and important to note. And the other one concerns the case of a prominent Bahraini who was arrested shortly after the uprisings, and he was charged with being an agent of Iran. And I believe this was Ali Salman, although if I'm wrong, I'm sure someone can correct me. But in the interviews that I did for my recent book, where a shameless plug of it is here, there is a really interesting story about how in the formative stages of the counter-revolution against the protesters, Ali Salman was framed as an Iranian agent. But yet after about 2016, all of a sudden there were reports to say that, well, no, Ali Salman wasn't an Iranian agent. He was actually a Qatari agent. And there is evidence to prove it because he took calls from the Qatar embassy and took calls from other representatives from Qatar. So about that same time, we know that the blockade took place. So if we can see what's happening across regional affairs, we can also see that there are interesting dimensions playing out at local politics. So I think it's really important that we start to take the two hand in hand. That security is important for understanding how domestic politics plays out, but also we need to understand the ways in which this broader regional environment within which Gulf states are operating, be it in terms of the rivalry between the Saudis and the Iranians, or be it in terms of the rise in tensions between the Saudi, Emirati, Bahraini bloc and Qatar. So there's a couple of interesting points there. I want to just add a bit to Olivia's presentation in terms of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. And this is something to say that, look, this isn't a static, immutable rivalry. And we've got a report coming out in a week or two, depending when we can get the copy editing done, that looks at the ways in which this rivalry can potentially be addressed. And the contribution that I make with Edward Wasnich is to say that, look, over time, this rivalry has played out in a range of different ways. It's not just fixed, it's not just one form of hostility. It's not just about religion, or it's not just about geopolitics, or it's not just about religion and geopolitics, but it's shaped by the contingencies of time, and it's shaped by the contingencies of space. And so if you look at what happened in the 1920s, prior to the establishment of the third and current Saudi state, you see that Ibn Saud had an interesting relationship with the Shah of Iran. There was collaboration, there was cooperation, but there were certain things that Ibn Saud was not able to do with the Shah, because the Shah was reluctant to do it because of the pressure from his own domestic population, who were, particularly the clerics, of course, who were anti the strict Wahhabi policies put in place by Ibn Saud. So there's an interesting dimension there, even though there was a period where it was said that the two were able to work together. Well, yeah, they did, but there were also these complexities, these complex undercurrents that challenged some of these burgeoning bits of rapprochement or burgeoning diplomatic relations. Now, of course, 79 changed everything. It added a real sort of vociferously fraught nature to the rivalry. But even that didn't last. In the 1990s, you saw a period of rapprochement again emerging, in part due to the death of Khomeini and the emergence of more I say liberal, but liberal in the terms of the Iranian context, officials such as Rafsanjani, who were more open to the idea of economic dealings, more open to the idea of dialogue and relations with the Saudis. But again, there's something interesting here that I think relates to today, in that this wasn't just the consequence of changing political elites, but rather it was triggered in part by a massive earthquake that took place in Manjil, which resulted in around 60,000 deaths. This was in June 1990. And that earthquake created the space, I've argued, and I think it's a really interesting point, that it created the space for this burgeoning rapprochement. It opened up an opportunity for the Saudis to send aid to Iran in this time of crisis, and for the Iranians to accept it. Of course, the ways in which the domestic political scene had changed helped this to resonate, helped it to find traction. But I think that earthquake was actually really quite important in terms of creating an opportunity. And I do wonder if COVID-19 is that type of seismic opportunity. So we know that the Emirates has sent aid to Iran. The Emirates sent a great deal of aid, and a number of Gulf states had sent messages of wishes and positivity, but not Saudi Arabia. Interestingly, but the Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, but not the Saudis. So perhaps the earthquake itself was important, but it had to go alongside the political reforms. And so COVID-19 is important, but it has to go alongside a changing political context inside of the two states. Now, some of the work that we've been trying to do has involved some dialogue with folks in both states, and the Iranians are certainly willing to talk. But the time has to be right for them and for the Saudis. And I think it's really important that all of these ducks, if you want, have to be lined up. There have to be the right types of conditions in line for all of these efforts to facilitate dialogue and improve relations to take hold. Because I think there are a number of areas where there could be, I guess, scope for a burgeoning rapprochement. We know that COVID-19 has changed the security, political, economic scene, but there were a number of issues that the two states were already facing. We know that the Iranian economy has been devastated by US sanctions. The Saudi economy needs vast investment in order to facilitate MBS's transformation of the Saudi state, led by obviously the flagship NEOM project, but it needs huge amounts of foreign direct investment, and it was struggling for a whole range of reasons that we don't have time to go into now. So there were economic pressures before the COVID-19 crisis. There's also this complex role of the United States, as Kristian was talking about. So given that the Saudis have been increasingly concerned about the role of the US, not just under Obama, but also confused about how the Trump presidency is panning out, I think that's an interesting and important area to watch. Although the Saudis have long been reliant on the United States, and Iran has long viewed the United States as a threat to regional security, preferring a region-first approach. This COVID-19 evolution, pandemic, has created an evolution in regional relations that means that the United States may not able to support the Saudis. It may not be able to do this militarily. It may choose not to have this vast investment in terms of its foreign policy and its military presence across the world. So the US already had an ambiguous position, and now it's facing its own challenges, which may in turn open up possibilities for a realignment. And there's also the sense that Qatar may well just be the new bad guy. That Qatar is perhaps the state that replaces Iran as the bête noire, if you will, of Gulf politics. That the Saudis and the Emiratis perhaps don't care quite as much about the Iranians anymore. They've seen Iran decimated economically and politically. And so now they've turned their attention to Qatar. But of course, that's perhaps slightly too early to tell. And I think one of the things that's really important here is that a lot of water has gone under the bridge, the proverbial bridge here, creating a number of structural impediments that may make any type of rapprochement between the two quite difficult to achieve. And this, I think, resonates with regard to sectarianization, with regard to the conflation of domestic and regional politics, with regard to the ways in which ruling elites have sought to regulate life within the context of changing political and security environments. And it's difficult to untangle some of these things. It's difficult to unwind what has happened and to de-escalate, to desectarianize, if you will, the ordering of life across the region. And I think it's going to take a lot of time, but the COVID-19 crisis has created space and an opportunity to start rethinking about some of these issues. And I think that's my time up, because I can feel that oh yeah, there you go, bang on. Thank you so much, AK. Yeah, that's me done. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for an excellent presentation as well. And thank you to all of you who've been posing questions in the Q&A box. That's really great to see so many fascinating and interesting questions. I mean, this panel has certainly looked at the GCC from various different perspectives. There's been the within-state perspective with the creation of public opinions and granting of citizenship. There's been the regional interstate perspective with the threat perceptions and frictions among the Gulf states, as Kristian mentioned, and the Saudi-Iranian relationship and its political economic component, which Simon was talking about. And then finally, there's also been a global perspective looking at the impact of the United States foreign policies in the regions. So it has truly been a very diverse panel in terms of angles and perspectives. We're going to start with the first question, which is directed at Kristian. It comes from Umar Karim. He writes a very important and interesting point made by Professor Ulrichsen regarding the political conflict with Iran sobering up. Does this also mean that the Saudi and Emirati threat perception is actually changing, and both of them now consider Qatar, but much more Turkey, as a much bigger threat than is the ideological and thus greater in scale? Particularly with the situation in the Eastern Province sobering up, the internal dimension of Iranian threat perhaps is not strong, while that from Qatar, Turkey is much stronger. Pardon my loud reading.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's been apparent for some time that threat perceptions have been shifting quite dramatically, and that if you are a Saudi or Emirati policymaker in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi, perceived threat from Qatar or from Turkey is very different from the perceived threat from Iran in terms of an ideological threat aimed at the domestic Sunni constituencies of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as to some extent has been perceived. And we saw that in 2014 and 2013, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and also in the way it was portrayed in 2017 as well. And both for the Saudis and the Emiratis, the instinctive response to unrest in Bahrain and in Eastern Province in 2011 was to try and look for a scapegoat, an external actor to blame, to kind of externalize the cause of discontent, to deflect attention away from any domestic political or economic grievance that might be behind it. And we saw very quickly how in 2012, when you saw large-scale demonstrations in Kuwait, how once you began to see political demonstrations spreading among Sunni Gulf communities, you very quickly saw how the Muslim Brotherhood replaced Iran as the external actor, kind of external scapegoat. And so, it's a very different level of threat perception, but absolutely from a perspective of a policymaker in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, especially the de-escalation and tension with Iran, and you're worried not so much about potential unrest among Shia, that you can just sort of try and sort of blame Iran because you know that will play the right buttons in Washington or in London, then definitely looking at Qatar and looking at Turkey and trying to claim that there's a sort of transnational hand behind any potential unrest among Sunni Gulf Arabs is something that they have already tried to do. And we may well see this continue, I think, especially if, as I said, and Simon pointed out, Qatar becomes sort of in the imagination of people in Abu Dhabi, especially, I think, the sort of the bad boy, the bad guy of regional politics.
Yes, thank you, Kristian. Do you have anything else to add to the answer? No, thank you so much. I think we'll move on with two questions which are posed by Lawrence Rubin. And the first one is to Luciano, and it goes, to what extent does a Gulf regime's view of its domestic political order affect the way it views regional political order? And he asks you to pick any country you'd like. There's also one to Kristian again, which is, which, if any, of the GCC states have changed their view of regional order in the last decade? If there has been changes in view, was it externally or internally driven? And if not, why do you think this hasn't happened? So if we start with Luciano first and then move on to Kristian.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. To what extent? To a big extent. I mean, my suggestion is that the way in which the Arab Spring affected the GCC states mainly is showing that their views about the regional and local order was threatened by things that they were not shared by the other GCC states. And this way, when, for instance, for Saudi Arabia, you asked me to pick an example. I think the most clear example is Saudi Arabia. For Saudi Arabia, Arab Spring represented the pop-up of different kind of threats represented by liberals that they were demanding for change, Shias that they were asking for change, different Islamist groups, etc., that they were participating in demonstrations or demanding things from the states, and they were all considered a threat for the regime survival. Saudi Arabia wanted to export this threat perception to the other GCC states in order to say, okay, we need to tackle all these problems together. Iran was also a threat. Since some of the other GCC states did not share this threat perception, for Qatar, for Kuwait, even Bahrain, Islamists or Muslim brothers were not a threat. They became part of the problem. Iran was not part of the problem by Qatar, Kuwait, or Oman. So these three countries become part of the problem. So the way in which they see regional order is the same way they see their internal order. If something threatens their internal order for Saudi Arabia, but this can reflect all the GCC states, is also endangering the regional order. So they have the same kind of perception to what extent this is considered a threat, and how the regional order should be designed, addressing those threats that are not common or are not shared by all the states. I'm not quite sure if this is replying what you ask, but this is my idea of how their personal or the individual perceptions about what is threatening the regime survival is affecting the way that they want to the regional order to be or to be designed.
Thank you, Luciano. I think we'll go on to Kristian's question about the GCC states' view of regional order in the last decade.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Multi-part question, very interesting. To some extent, every country has viewed the regional order as evolving. I mean, it's not static. It's evolved in different ways in different countries, obviously. And I mean, Qatar, for example, now sees the GCC states, or some of the GCC states, as threats. UAE and Saudi Arabia, for example, now see value in trying to move beyond just a GCC or kind of a Gulf regional order that has been kind of, I guess, dependent on the US for security. We've seen diversification of security and defense agreements, for example. We've seen a continuation of the economic aspects of the regional order continuing to Asianize. We've seen sort of regional order split between a continuing security dynamic that's focused west, an economic dynamic that's focused east, and to some extent the splintering of the GCC as a coherent regional organization. Why that's happened? Partly internal, the passing of the last generation of leaders who kind of built the GCC in 1981. The Emir of Kuwait, Emir Sabah, is the last of that generation, really, that was kind of heavily involved. He was the Kuwaiti foreign minister at the time, and he was heavily involved in putting the GCC together. Sultan Qaboos, of course, was the last actual head of state from 1981 who was still alive. But to some extent, we've seen a new generation of leaders who are much more assertive, much more willing to rock the boat, much less consensual, much less perhaps willing to kind of talk with each other behind closed doors to come to an agreement. And of course, that generational thing is not purely generational in terms of age. I mean, Mohammed bin Zayed, for example, is old enough to be Mohammed bin Salman's father, but it's certainly a different generation from the figures that built the GCC, were much more consensual, who were kind of all around until the mid to late 2000s. And then, of course, the Arab Spring also sharpened a lot of those differences. And then partly also just because of two successive US presidential administrations, both kind of perplexed some of the Gulf partners by their actions and their activities. And so from a regional order point of view, we just seen also external, the UAE has a French naval, French base, we have Britain returning to the Gulf, we have increased focus on kind of non-traditional actors, Turkey, for example, and Qatar. Russia's made inroads. This is just a much more internationalized Gulf, and I think the internationalization of the Gulf will continue and will accelerate in the 2020s, especially in the wake of whatever is left of US policy after the Trump administration passes, whether or not it's this November or another 4 years. So with that, I'll pass you back.
Thank you so much, Kristian. We have a question which is directed at all the panelists now. So if you could please raise your hand if you would like to tap in on that question. So the question is from Mehran Hagirian, and I'm sorry if I don't pronounce that name correctly. And it goes, in what ways does foreign policy influence or is influenced by public opinion in the GCC states, particularly when considering Iran? And how does sectarianism factor in? So this is a pretty broad question, but please let me know by raising your hand, and please unmute yourself. Simon, you would like to answer here.
Sure. We don't know is the short answer, because it's notoriously difficult to gauge public opinion. We've got a good idea, we've got a good sense of what's going on, but we don't know in the same way that, for example, in the UK, you would have, say, YouGov surveys on particular things, getting polling work done, as Justin Gengler from Monday would tell you, is notoriously difficult, particularly in some states more than others, and particularly with regard to certain sensitive questions. So it is quite difficult to ascertain, but there are certain things that we can share. I mean, we know that in the zeitgeist, for example, that's a good way of assessing the extent to which a group of people feel about something. So, for example, in the interviews I did for my recent book, I spoke to an Emirati woman who was also half Yemeni. We were speaking about her views about the Emirati involvement in the Yemeni conflict, and her view of it, even as an Emirati Yemeni who was really concerned about the repercussions on the Yemeni state, was to say, look, it's needed. It was essential in fighting against Iran. It was essential that we did this on the front line against the Iranian state. We need to make sure that Iran didn't get a foothold on the Arabian Peninsula. And I said, okay, well, why do you say that? What sort of evidence do you have for that? And she said, well, it's all over the TV, it's all over the news, it's all over the radio, it's in adverts, it's in discussion shows, it's in soap operas. It's this sense that it's a narrative that was spreading across the state. So it may not be that it's exactly quantifiable in terms of public opinion, but there is this sense that there are these views that are being held. With regard to Iran, it's perhaps slightly changing. I wonder if Qatar is again a more prominent source of frustration and anger. But yeah, I think I'll leave my thoughts there. I think it's more anecdotal though than hard quantifiable fact.
Thank you, Simon, for a great answer. Luciano, you're raising your hand. Please.
Just to follow up what Simon said, in Qatar there is a survey conducted by C3. Justin can talk about that. That was showing how the public opinion was slightly changing about Iran after the blockade. I mean the bad image that Iran had in Iran changed after the first month of blockade, in which Iran opened their airspace to Qatar and provided help, etc., etc. The problem is it has not been a systematic question. I mean, it's very difficult to compare what happened before or after, and if this is creating changing the policy by the state, or is the opposite? It's the policy of the state which is changing the public opinion, which is something more or less what you say. If media is owned by the state, media is reproducing the official narrative. Actually, it's the state which is creating public opinion regarding some states, and mainly when it is related to Iran. We need to create a monster, which is Iran, so the public media will shape this public opinion, and then it's reproduced in the opinion polls. If the opposite happen, if Iran is changing their relation with the state will change its policy, and therefore they will move toward impressing these ideas to the population, that at the end of the day in the public opinion polls they would say, oh no, we are changing our ideas about Iran. So it's very difficult to determine which is first.
Thank you so much, Luciano. Olivia, you marked before. Are you still interested in tapping on this question?
Sorry, I had to find the unmute button. Yes, the one from Ichaso. If I remember correctly, Ichaso asked, basically saying that I alluded to the use of sectarianism on the Iranian and the Saudi side, but however, I have here exemplified Saudi Arabia. Very true. In this paper, actually, I'm more looking at the representation of Iran. I mean, how Saudi Arabia on one hand tries to frame Iran, and how Iran tries to frame itself in conjunction with the stance each of them has towards the nuclear deal, right? I said the one being in favor of it and the other one not so much. However, I have another paper in the works where I'm looking precisely at how Iran is representing Saudi Arabia in its foreign policy discourse. One thing I can say here is that, I mean, Iran's position is quite different, right? It's already a non-Arab, non-Sunni state. So Iran is actually not tapping into this divide, this Sunni-Shia divide per se. Actually, Iran is more of, tries to strike a inclusionary tone, framing itself more in terms of Islam in general, you know, wanting to insert itself into this community of Islamic nations, because they already don't belong to the Sunni states, and emphasizing this divide would make them drift even further away. I hope I have answered this a little bit in this paper. It's true, I did not allude to this in greater detail.
Thank you, Olivia, for elaborating on that. I think we'll go on to a question posed by Thomas Fiebiger, and it's for Luciano and perhaps others. So please tap in if you have comments on that question. So the question goes, how would you assess the impact of the Tidnis inviting new citizens on sectarian dynamics in Bahrain, but perhaps also the wider GCC? So I guess Luciano will start.
Yeah. I was trying to unmute it. I mean, in the Bahraini case, I think it was very, very clear that that report that denounced that around 50,000 people were nationalized. I assume that you are talking about the nationalizing, I mean, inviting new citizens by nationalizing expat or non-nationals. If we bear in mind that the people, for instance, that I mean, in Bahrain there are 1.7 million people and 500,000 are Bahrainis, nationalizing 50,000 in few years is changing drastically the balance. I mean, there are no statistics about how many Shias are, but if there are more than half, let's say 250,000 or 300,000, nationalizing 50,000 is quite representative of how much the nationalization policy can change the distribution of Sunni Shias in that country, and at the end of the day, how important can be in terms of elections. Of course, now the elections in Bahrain are not very representative, but when the elections started to be important after the new constitution in 2002, and after the first electoral process, multi-party process with the presence of al-Wefaq and what party was allowed. The idea that the Wefaq party was not winning the election was important. Nowadays, maybe it's more, it's not that important because elections are actually not representative of this group of people, mainly from supporters of the Wefaq, that they are boycotting the election. But at that time, in 2006 and 2010, during this peak of the participation efforts by the civil society was important. To what extent this is important in other GCC states, I think is much less important because the imbalance between Sunnis and Shia are less important. But we have cases like in Qatar that they nationalized, or they were trying to nationalize, for instance, people from Bahraini origin, but only Sunnis, and the Bahrainis were complaining that this was affecting their nationalization policy as well, because what they were accusing Qatar is that they were taking Sunni citizens, but not Shia. So this is also a game that they are all playing about. But since we don't have real statistics about religions, sectarian backgrounds in the GCC context, it's very difficult to quantify that.
Thank you, Luciano. Does anyone else in the panel feel like tipping in? Simon, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, just to add to that, just briefly, again, talking with Bahraini friends and colleagues about this, there's an interesting issue at play here in the sense that it adds an additional line to the inclusive, exclusive dimension, right? In the sense that whilst there may be a sense that you're bringing in more Sunnis to support any efforts that you're making to try and address a demographic imbalance along sect-based lines, you're also creating an additional layer of exclusion between Arabs and non-Arabs. And so it strikes me that in addressing one problem, you're also creating an additional problem in the longer term, which speaking with Bahraini interviewees, colleagues, friends, they've addressed and acknowledged and said it's more a case of trying to address the short-term issue and that will be dealt with in the future, even though there is the acknowledgement that it is a problem and it does need to be resolved because that will be the next cleavage in society.
Thank you, Simon. And also just to again say thank you to all the participants who keep posting questions in the Q&A. It's nice to see that there's so many interesting questions. The next question we'll take up here in the panel, in the plenum, is one which relates to the global perspective. And it's directed at Kristian or Simon, so I guess it's up to you who to begin. And it goes, how do the different GCC countries perceive Trump's January idea of a NATO Middle East? Is it gaining any traction, and where do things stand? So who would like to start? Kristian, you're on.
Okay, I mean, well, the NATO Middle East is, well, first off, you talk to US officials, they always get quite adamant that it's not an Arab NATO. It's something rather less than that. It's, for example, there's no common threat perception. There's no real political element to it. It was a workaround put in place by the Trump administration to try and take politics out of the equation, to at least ensure that you have the sort of military and security cooperation between the US and its partners by adding Egypt and also Jordan to it. You look at the GCC states that have all taken part. So the only country that's pulled out is actually Egypt. It's not none of the GCC states. I think there's a degree of them going along because they feel that this is something that the administration feels is important to them. And so they don't want to get on the wrong side of the president over this. So they go along with it. They take part in the meetings. But, I mean, there's no real progress that's been made. I mean, they meet, or at least they would meet in the past. Now that you can no longer physically meet, at least temporarily. but it would be a talking shop. I mean, they would just meet for the sake of going through the motions. That this is something that the administration wants, and no Gulf country is willing to go against it. So it's no substitution for a fully fledged partnership that doesn't have any political rift within it. And it's a workaround. It's at least contained and maintains some sort of dialogue. But especially from the Qataris, the Omanis, I think the Kuwaitis, they feel they're there just to sort of go along with the administration. Saudis and Emiratis, I think, feel that the dynamic that they have by themselves is very different. And you have a Emirati-Saudi coordination on a military level, and for them, I think that's their main priority, not the Middle East Strategic Alliance.
Yes. Simon, would you like to continue? No, Simon.
No, I think Kristian nailed it. I think
shaking his head. I think that means we will go on to the next question. And again, I apologize for my pronunciation here. The question is from Nsive Hichret Bataloglu, and it's for Dr. Ulrichsen. So Nsive says, do you think that the notion of relations with Iran has faded away as an instrumental tool in determining intra-GCC relations? Or does it still matter across time, space, and topic in these relations among the GCC states?
It was interesting how in 2017, the list of 12 demands that were made against Qatar, together with the 13th demand that was, you have 10 days to comply or the list becomes invalid. So there were 12, not 13 demands. And Iran was number one. And that has really it caused a lot of consternation in especially Kuwait and Oman, because if the Saudis and Emiratis were going to use Iran against Qatar, they could use it against them too. And if you remember back in January 2017, the very week that the Trump administration took office, the Kuwaitis actually reached out to the Iranians with a proposal to try and begin a GCC-Iran dialogue, dial down tension. The Iranians responded positively, and then the Kuwaiti Foreign Minister, Sheikh Sabah al-Khalid, who's now the Prime Minister, went to Iran to meet Zarif, and they talked about it. And then Rouhani actually went to Kuwait and to Oman in the middle of February 2017. And then Sheikh Sabah in Kuwait traveled to Oman to meet with Sultan Qaboos to talk about progress and how it could go forward. Now, that ultimately got overtaken. It got overtaken by, obviously, by the blockade, by the use of Iran as one of the justifications for launching the blockade. Kuwait-Iran ties were also strained by the discovery of a big arms cache in Kuwait and sort of linking it to Iran, but so it never went anywhere. But there was certainly a desire in Kuwait and in Oman, especially when Trump was coming in, to do something to try and de-escalate, to make sure that you at least keep a dialogue going. And I think that desire is still there. And I think arguably it might be another opening now with COVID, as Simon said, and with what we've seen over in January between the US and Iran. That opening, I think, is still there. And actually, that could now be shared to a greater degree by the UAE, if not by Saudi Arabia, especially since 2019. So we'll have to see what develops. But certainly, now that the UAE sees Iran in less kind of hubristic terms, you could see at least more of a potential for some sort of rapprochement to sort of take root. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristian. I think we have time for at least another question. And here again...
Can I just add something?
Yes.
Sorry. I completely agree with Kristian, but I wonder if there's something else that needs to be reflected on, though, in the sense that after the attacks that you identify, Kristian, I found that the Saudi response quite peculiar, and that at times it seemed to be seeking to escalate the crisis, and then at other times, particularly after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, it worked very hard to de-escalate And so if Iran is still that figure of regional concern, then it strikes me that MBS has worked so very hard to counter Iranian gains. And some would say that he's worked very hard to push towards a conflict with Iran. But then when he got to that point, when it seemed that there was serious scope for things to escalate and the opportunity for either the Saudis or the Americans or whoever to do something, then there was a concerted effort to work towards de-escalation, not only in terms of the Soleimani incident, but also in terms of the attacks from earlier in 2019. So I just wonder, what was your take on that, if I may?
Well, that's a very good point. And I think to some extent, MBS probably went to the brink and pulled back because he, or at least the team around him, realized that for the first time there would be consequences to the rhetoric that he had been pursuing. And if you look at MBS's record so far, he's big on the sort of 30,000-foot rhetoric, big picture, but it's kind of often when he hasn't necessarily suffered consequences. No one's ever really been kind of telling him, no, that's a bad idea. And I think the shock of what happened, both in September, but then also in January, was such that even for MBS, he then saw the potential consequences for Saudi Arabia, which he then obviously sees as his own sort of right to rule and heavily bound up in that. If something happens bad to Saudi Arabia, it will implicate him too. And so I think that pulled him back from the brink, because he also could no longer feel secure that he would have the US at his back. And so those two combinations, the cathartic shock of what happened in September cannot be underestimated. The notion not only that something could happen at that scale, but there would be no tangible or visible US response, I think really caused the Saudi leadership to reassess a lot of what they had taken for granted in terms of deterrence and in terms of their own power projection capability. And so for MBS at least, and of course his father is still in the picture, so we don't know to what extent his father was perhaps cautioning MBS or counseling a degree of pragmatism. But I do think we need to emphasize that the king is still in the picture. He's not out of the policy-making process. And also, for example, on the Palestinian issue, when MBS went too far in 2018 on his visit to the US, it was the king who pulled back. It was the king who kind of restated Saudi Arabia's support and commitment to the Palestinian issue with making it, for example, a centerpiece of the Arab League summit in Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, there is still a degree of sort of restraint or constraint on MBS from the king, and perhaps this might have been also one of those elements. But again, I'm just speculating in a lack of any hard evidence either way.
Thank you. It was interesting to have some dialogue between some of the panelists, and this topic of de-escalation actually leads very well into the final question, I guess, of today's panel. The question is about de-escalation from bottom up, you can say, and it's from Drury Dyke, who notes the absence of any real civil society, save perhaps in Kuwait and to some extent in another way in Iran. So she argues that maybe had it existed, it might have made formal bridge building and cross-community and cross-country support a little bit easier. Any thoughts on what sorts of conditions may give rise to such sort of civil society in the Arab Gulf, and how and whether could they make common cause with Iranians, with Iranian counterparts, sorry. Is that a bit of a dream, she asked. And her question is directed at Simon, but if any other of the panelists would like to tap in, please raise your hand. But I think we'll start with Simon.
That's kind of you. Thank you. And thanks, Drury, for the question. I think it's really interesting. I don't know the answer to the question at present, but it's something that CEPAD is looking to work in and on, and it's done quite a bit of stuff with regard to civil society and the ways in which grassroots organizations are working together or working to independently to shift political landscapes, to change the ways in which politics plays out, both within the context of political systems, but also in some cases to facilitate some type of revolutionary change. So I think the work that civil society groups are doing is so very important in terms of, as you say, dragging citizenship practice into the millennium, and particularly in terms of gender and nationality. I think it's complex because what you see is that embedded within all of this is a set of cultural and traditional practices that have been used by ruling elites as a means of regulating life, as a means of building up communal societies, as a means of ensuring a degree of stability, and as well solidifying rule. And you see that across the Gulf. The use of tribal dress, for example, is a space of performance whereby rulers, elites can demonstrate their credibility through the way they dress, through the way that they hold counsel, through the way that they are sort of depicting themselves, presenting themselves in public. So to facilitate reform away from that, I think, is actually quite difficult because it means untangling the presence of these traditional values within everyday life. And it also leaves regimes open, I think, for other actors, civil society actors, to use these same mechanisms as a way of maybe deactivating some of the power of regimes. And we talked a bit about this yesterday in terms of desectarianization. So it's a complex set of phenomena that isn't easily addressed. But I think the work that you're doing, Drury and Salam and other organizations, is so very important, because the first step, of course, is talking about it, having a dialogue about it, and raising awareness about some of the issues. And it's from that you can start to try and move forward and facilitate real lasting change, putting pressure on states where necessary, and supporting civil society organizations, human rights activists as well, wherever necessary.
Thank you, Simon. Do any other panelists have a final word? Yeah, Luciano, you have a comment or question? Please unmute yourself, Luciano.
Yeah, I was trying to find out. Yeah, just to follow up, just a brief reflection about I mean, I cannot answer the question as well, because I'm not quite convinced about the independence of civil society organizations in the whole region. But I think that it's something that was mentioned, I think, by Simon before. This COVID-19 crisis showed that there's no difference between sex, nationalities, ethnicities, or anything else. And the fact that the first cases of COVID-19 infected in the GCC states were national GCC citizens coming from Iran shows that there is no way that links between nationals from one side or the other can be cut. If this is not a reason for civil society organizations or groups or social groups or even governments to realize that there's no way to separate both shores of the Gulf, and that they cannot prevent links between populations, I mean, I don't know what else we need to realize that. If someone is taking this lesson from GCC and from Iran, I would really support that. We tried many times of track to dialogues, academic diplomacy or whatever, and it didn't work that much, because at the end of the day, as I said before, independence from the state or independence from the government is very complicated for civil society organizations. But we need to learn from the lessons we are we are witnessing now. So maybe this is the occasion to start with something. Just I wanted to say that.
And with that, I think we're reaching the end of our 5th panel. Thank you so much to all the panelists for excellent presentations and a very vivid Q&A session. And of course, also thank you to all of you who've tuned in for listening and participating with questions. It's been a pleasure to see so many people here on Zoom present from their homes. As the COVID-19 keeps affecting our society and working environment, I expect there might be more opportunities for online activities. What will come, I cannot say, but please do follow CEPAD on our webpage and on Twitter, and we will keep informing you about how we move on during these difficult but also interesting times. And also thank you again for everyone who's been involved in organizing and presenting throughout the week. I can say for myself, it's been a great pleasure to participate in all these panels, both as a speaker and as an audience. And last but not least, also a big thanks to Carnegie for supporting the CEPAD project. We really appreciate the financial support that we get from you and all the good advices and conversations. So with that, I think I'll conclude the session.